handle method. Let's create a test case and try to implement our unit test. I'll start with a fact attribute. This will be an asynchronous test, so I'm going to use an async task. I'm testing the handle method, and I'll say should return failure when the user is null. Let's add the arrange, act, and assert steps, and now you're going to see how easy it is to write unit tests once we've done all the heavy lifting with the setup. I want to configure the user repository mock, and more specifically the getById async method when it's called with our command user ID, and we pass in any cancellation token, and this is a syntax from endsubstitute, allowing us to provide specific values for the parameters on our mocked service. Then I can also access the returns method like we did with the property on the datetime provider, and I can configure what this method should return. In this case, I want to return a null instance of a user, and then in the act step, I can just create a variable to hold my result, and I can call my reserve booking command handler, invoke the handle method, and pass in the command instance. For the cancellation token, we can pass in default because it's not important, and now I can write my assert step where I can basically say that the result error should be user errors, and then I can pass the not found error. We wrote a lot of code in the setup, but this allowed us to write our test case with just a few lines of code. So let's go ahead and run our unit test before we continue adding any additional test cases. I'm going to run this test case, and you will see that is going to pass. Now I'm going to add some helper classes in my unit test project for providing the user and apartment data. So inside of the users folder, I'm going to add the user data class, and the implementation will be somewhat similar to what we had in the domain unit test project. I'm mainly interested in the static create method that's going to allow me to create a test user for my application unit tests. I'm also going to add a new helper inside of the apartments folder. I'm going to add a class that I will call apartment data, and then the implementation of this class is going to allow me to create a new apartment instance that I'm going to use inside of my test cases. So let's go back to our reserve booking test cases, and let's see what is the next unit test that I want to write. If I take a look at the handler, it will be the test case when the apartment is fetched from the repository and the value that we got back is null. For us to be able to get to this step, we actually need to return a user, so this is going to make our configuration slightly different. So let's go ahead and write our test case. I'm going to say public async task. I will call this handle should return failure when the apartment is null. Let's add the arrange, act, and assert steps. I'm going to copy the setup from my arrange step above, where I'm configuring the user repository mock, and I'm going to make it return a user instance. I will use the user data create method to obtain an actual user instance, and then I'm going to return this from my getById async method call. Now for the apartment repository mock, I'm going to configure it to return null for the apartment. For that I need the getById async method, and let's pass in the apartment ID from our command object. We're going to pass in any for the cancellation token, and I'm going to say that this returns a null apartment instance. The act step is going to be the same, and also the assert step, only we're going to check for a different error. In this case, we are expecting an apartment errors not found. You can see how it was much easier to write a second test case. Let's go ahead and run the two test cases that we have, and you will see that they are both passing. Let's add a few more test cases. If we go back to our handle method, we have a validation check here, making sure that the apartment isn't already booked for the specified start and end date. So let's see how we would unit test this in our test case. I'm going to create a new test case, and I'm going to call it handle should return failure when the apartment is booked. Let's reuse what we had in the previous test, and I'm going to make a few adjustments. We're going to need an apartment instance. Let's go ahead and use the apartment data object and call the create method. Then I'm going to make the apartment repository return the apartment instance. I'm going to define a duration which contains the values for my command start and end date, and then I can use it to configure my booking repository. I'm going to set up the isOverlappingAsync method, which takes in an apartment and a date range instance and is going to return true, meaning that the apartment is already booked, in which case we are going to get back an error object. And the specific error that I want to test is the booking errors object, and we're going to look for the overlap error. So let me pass in overlap, and let's run our new test case. So the unit tests are going to execute, and you will see that all of our tests are passing. The test setup is already becoming a bit cumbersome, so I'm going to add a new test case and I'm going to explain what we have inside. It's very similar to what we had in the previous test case. We are setting up the user, the apartment, and the date range object, configuring the user repository mock, the apartment repository mock. This time the booking repository mock is going to return false, meaning that the apartment isn't already booked, and we are going to proceed to create a booking in our handle method. So this will be this part of the code here, and we're going to add the booking to the repository and call the save changes on the unit of work. And I configured the unit of work mock to throw a concurrency exception when we call the save changes async method. If this happens, we're going to land in the catch statement here and return an overlap error. So that's what I'm going to test in this test case, and let's see if it's going to pass. You can see our new test case is passing. Let me add another one that's going to verify the happy path in the handle method. In this case, I'm setting up all of the mocks to return the correct values, and we are just executing the handle method and verifying that the result object that we get back is a success result. So if I run my unit tests again, you will see that they are all passing, including the test case for the happy path in the handle method. One more thing that could be interesting to test in your application unit tests is that the values that you are passing into your mocked instances contain the correct values. The handle method here is returning the booking identifier, and we can use this value to check the booking object that was passed in to our booking repository mock. So let me show you how we would write a test case for this. I'm going to define another test case here. So let's start with the fact attribute. I'm going to add public async task, and let's say handle should call the repository when the booking is reserved. I'm going to add the arrange, act, and assert steps, and I can actually copy the setup from my previous test case because I'm interested in the happy path of our handle method. So let me add the arrange step, and we can use the act step as before. But what's going to change is the assert step, because this time I want to verify that my booking repository mock was called with the correct values. So how you can do that is access your mocked instance, and then I'm going to call the received method, which allows me to check that my mock has received a specific method call. You can also specify what is the number of calls that you expect to see. For example, I can say that the mock received one call, and then I can chain a call to the specific method that I want to test. So let's say I want to test the add method, but how would I check the booking instance that was passed into this method? You can use the arg static class to provide a delegate that's going to verify the actual argument, and I'm going to use the is method because I want to test a specific booking instance, and I'm going to write a delegate checking that the booking ID that was passed in as an argument matches the result value that I get back from my handle method. This kind of test is coupled to your implementation, and in general it's not advised that you test the implementation details of your components. Rather, you should focus on the behavior which is reflected by the results returned by your components, which is what we were doing up until now. But I also want to show you how you can write this type of test. So let's go ahead and run all of our test cases again, and you will see that they are all passing, and we have managed to fully test our reserve booking command handler. One more thing I'm going to briefly mention is code coverage. That might be an interesting metric. If you have an extension like ReSharper, you can use it to cover the unit test from your solution. So I'm going to run this command, and we're going to observe the results. You can see the coverage report from ReSharper here, and if we take a look at the application layer and scope it down to the reserve booking command handler, you will see that we have 100% code coverage. This just means that the unit tests that we wrote go over all of the lines of code inside of this class, but test coverage isn't a guarantee that your code is going to be free of any bugs. However, it's still a useful metric in some regard, and you should try for your code coverage to be as high as possible while not sacrificing test quality. And now let's see how we are going to write integration tests.